Hi everyone, and welcome to week 3 of ECED 201. Can't believe it's already week 3, but here we are. And this week we are going to be talking about theories of development and learning. I will start out by saying that the textbook goes over a plethora of theories and theorists. The purpose of this presentation is not to be comprehensive and covering all of those in depth, so please do continue to refer to the Morrison text for details about some of the lesser covered theories. But I just wanted to highlight a few of the main guiding theories that I have found to be helpful in my own practice and that seem to be some of the most pervasive theories today in early childhood education settings. So, we're going to talk about what theories guide early childhood practice today and some of the major influences on our view of development and learning. So first, we'll start off by talking a little bit about constructivist learning theory. And this theory about cognitive development draws on the work of Piaget, Dewey, and Vygotsky. These are main names that you will continue to hear coming up in your coursework and your profession if you choose to enter the field of early childhood. And a constructivist approach really supports children's active role in seeking knowledge. So, in a constructivist theory, we are building on children's prior knowledge, and we acknowledge that direct experiences help children to develop cognitive processes that then result in knowledge. So, an example might be watching a child start to explore blocks. So, a constructivist approach says that a child who is an infant is going to start out exploring blocks by just looking at them, touching them, maybe putting them in their mouth, getting that sort of sensory feeling of exploring those blocks. And then as a child gets older and seeks an active role in learning, so they continue to build with those blocks, over time, they will eventually learn and engage with the blocks in a way that we would typically play with blocks, which might include stacking them or knocking them over and engaging with them as they learn from their experiences. And then they build on that prior knowledge of, oh, I can stack one block on top of this. Maybe I can stack another block. We can't think about constructivist approaches without also thinking about adaptation and the type of schemes or organized knowledge that develop over time. So schemes, assimilation, and accommodation are some key terms from this type of theory. And when we think about schemes, these are really just existing pieces of knowledge. So I have a scheme that in order to pedal a bike, my feet have to move the pedals. That's just an example of an existing piece of knowledge that I already know. Assimilation is then taking new information and incorporating that new information into existing schemes, or making sense of new situations based on previous knowledge. We take it one step further and think about accommodation, which is changing existing schemes based on new information, or to put it another way, adjusting to new situations. So I have a picture of a bicycle here because learning to ride a bike is a common way to think about how schemes develop over time through assimilation and accommodation. I believe there's also an example in your book of this with learning how to ride a bike. But in order to ride a bike, we might have some prior knowledge that pedaling a bike creates movement. We might have practiced that as a toddler on a tricycle or something that has 3 wheels or more than 2 wheels. So then when we start to learn a bicycle with 2 wheels, we can use assimilation to take the prior knowledge that we had, that pedaling a tricycle makes it move forward, and we can apply that to pedaling a bicycle that might have some training wheels or something like that. As we continue to go through this process of learning to ride a bike, we make accommodations based on new information, such as, even though the bike only has 2 wheels, I can learn to balance on it and pedal it with the help of training wheels, and then eventually when the training wheels come off, I can continue to pedal the bike and balance and move forward just like I did when there was increased support. I also have a video here for you, and this is posted on Blackboard. I won't play the full video, but we also want to think about Piaget's stages of development. So when we take a look at this video, we think about the ways that children are learning perspective, they're learning object permanence, and some other concepts that are in your textbook. But for this section, I really want you to focus on the sensory motor stage and the pre-operational stage. These are the stages that most children in early childhood settings who are up to 8 years old are going to be in according to Piaget's theory. So again, this video is on the Blackboard site for you. Please take a look at this and refer to your textbook. It gives some really great examples of some of the concepts of Piaget's stages of development. Additionally, we want to look at sociocultural theory. This is a different theory that also plays into our practice in early childhood. So when we think about sociocultural theory, Vygotsky comes to mind, and one of his main tenets or parts of this theory is the zone of proximal development, or the ZPD. And the zone of proximal development, put pretty simply, is just the range of tasks that a child can't quite yet do independently, but can complete with support. It also applies to adults. So these are the things that we are not quite proficient at on our own, but if we just have someone helping us think about it in a different way, or if we have some support with notes or Google, we can understand a concept. And this brings us to the concept of scaffolding, which is providing individual levels and types of support in order to help children complete the tasks that are in the zone of proximal development, and then removing these supports gradually as children become able to complete the tasks independently. So we want to remember that support is contingent on or depends on a child's response, and that we want to be taking a strengths-based approach. The point of looking at the zone of proximal development isn't to really focus on what the child isn't doing yet. We're not saying that that is a values-based judgment or saying that that's a bad thing that the child can't do that yet, but instead we want to be looking at providing supports in order to really help children learn and achieve what they can do as they progress through that zone. An example might be looking at a classroom setting, maybe you're in a preschool, and it's the beginning of the school year, much like it is now, and we want children to be able to line up in order to transition from classroom time to outdoor time for recess. So in order to scaffold that skill, children don't come into the classroom just automatically knowing how to make nice lines and be able to walk in a line down the hallway if you're in a school setting. So we might put little stickers or circles or some sort of visual representation on the floor of approximately where you would stand in line, and then scaffold that from taking away some of those visuals and then reminding children to find their spot on the floor, and then eventually transitioning to just verbal prompts of, okay, let's line up to go outside. We're scaffolding that skill so that children can be successful. Another theory mentioned in your textbook is the theory of multiple intelligences. And this is Gardner's theory, A lot of you actually chose to look at Gardner last week in our activity and create a social media profile for him. So I wanted to be sure and mention this theory. And within Gardner's theory, he identifies 9 different types of intelligence that children have, including visual intelligence, verbal intelligence, mathematical, bodily, or a lot of times we hear this referred to as kinesthetic, rhythmic learning, inter- and intrapersonal learning, naturalistic learning, and existential learning or intelligences. And I wanted to mention this here. I'm not going to go super in depth, but when we think about implications for teaching, it's important to know the background of this theory because Gardner has been very influential. But one of the things that his theory has sort of helped to contribute to this idea of is the idea of specific learning styles that is best for a child. And I just want to mention here that learning styles theories are still pretty widely spread, but have been largely debunked. So we all might have preferences for how we want to take in new information, but that doesn't mean that I am, for example, just a visual learner or that you are a kinesthetic learner. What this theory really helps us to know in early childhood and in the education field is that we should recognize the individual and unique needs of all children and provide multiple means of representation, expression, and engagement, because all of these different types of learning helps to increase how we're taking in information and being able to use that information. Multiple means of representation, expression, and engagement is actually part of universal design for learning, and we'll talk about that here in a few weeks when we start to talk about best practices. This chapter also goes over behaviorism and behavioral theories. And in a nutshell, behaviorism and behavioral theories looks at the fact that behaviors are learned through rewards and punishments. So Pavlov decided with his dog experiment to look at something called classical conditioning, which is basically providing a stimulus to elicit a response. So in Pavlov's experiment, he took food as the unconditioned stimulus. When you provide dogs with food, they start to salivate. Salivation is the unconditioned response. So what he did was he chimed a bell when he gave food to the dogs, which created the dog's response of salivation. After a while, when you take away the ringing, the food itself, which is the unconditioned stimulus, you still have the conditioned stimulus, which is that when the bell rings, the dogs were still salivating, even without the food. That is a classic example of classical conditioning. Watson, who some have referred to as the founder of behaviorism, believed that connections between a stimulus and response resulting in new behaviors was really the core of behavioral theory. And we also see that played out by Thorndike's work in reinforcement theory, or that consequences influence behavior. We have positive responses that increase behavior and unpleasant responses that decrease behavior. I have an example here from the office of classical conditioning. And let's just take a look at how Jim uses classical conditioning on Dwight. So in that scenario, Dwight still wanted a mint as soon as the sound happened that Jim had been pairing with giving him an Altoid. Expanding on behaviorist theories, these earlier theories, Skinner came up with the idea of operant conditioning, which is the process of learning that occurs after reinforcement. And examples of this includes modeling or verbal praise. So instead of having an unconditioned stimulus, like salivating when food arrives, this really draws on what is already happening and sort of the more natural consequences of behaviors. So if a child stacks a block and then you give that child verbal praise and say, "Great job, you stacked the block," every time that happens, they're going to start stacking the blocks more often, and they're going to continue trying to stack more blocks and so on. Bandura also contributed to behaviorist theories by coming up with social learning theory. And this is the theory that children learn new information from observations. That's really what it boils down to. Again, please look in the textbook for a little bit more detail, but for now, that's really all we need to know about social learning theory. I have another example of operant conditioning here for us from Big Bang Theory. And let's watch what happens when Sheldon rewards Penny with some chocolates.
Are you finished?
Well, thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure.
You can continue watching the video on Blackboard if you want. But again, just another example of operant conditioning. What are the implications for teaching of behaviorist theories? One of the biggest implications that we see now is the use of applied behavior analysis, or ABA, and the use of behaviorist principles in the classroom. So one of those principles can be observed here using the ABC model for teaching children new skills or behaviors. And we'll talk a little bit more about the ABC model when we talk about behavior and social emotional development in a couple of weeks. But I wanted to go ahead and provide this here so that you could see the connection. And using this approach, the A stands for antecedent, which is what happens before a behavior occurs. So that is step one in this figure, where we are creating opportunities to model and practice with appropriate support. The adult is setting up the environment to be able to see what happens before a behavior. In step two, the child practices a target skill or goal. So that might be using words to communicate. So in step one, the adult is going to arrange an opportunity that allows for the child to practice using his or her words. In step two, the child is actually going to do that thing, and that is the B, the behavior. And the C is the consequence or the reinforcement. So in this step, some type of feedback is provided. If the child was using words in order to request something, the reinforcement might be receiving that object. So for example, if the child was using his or her words to request Legos to play with during playtime, the feedback that's provided, or the consequence of that behavior, is that the child receives the Legos they asked for. The last theory that we're going to talk about today is ecological theory. And this is Bronfenbrenner's theory that views development as part of a complex system of relationships that impact the child's environment and learning. So I have this image here, which is similar to the one that's in your textbook. And within Bronfenbrenner's theory, each system influences and is influenced by the other systems. This theory actually continues to be expanded today, and it's most recently been updated to be called the bioecological theory, but for now, relevant to your text and a basic understanding, ecological theory is fine. Within this theory, we start at ourselves, or the child, and then growing from there, we look at the microsystem. So these are the things that directly impact us. These are things like family, school, peers. So if we're thinking about our own ecosystem, an example of my microsystem would be my husband, my parents, George Mason, folks in the doctoral program, and you all as students. The mesosystem for me, which is one layer out from that, really focuses on the interactions between myself and the microsystem. So these interactions are going to be the relationship